Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited about because we've officially reached video 1 of my end of the year, new year video content, which is always my favorite to make. Today I'm going to be chatting through the worst or most disappointing reads I had for the year 2022. I feel like for 2022 I either had home runs, but I also had a lot of books that were just kind of okay or did not live up to the hype or my own expectations. That being said, I do have 9 books to chat about today, and some of them are going to be a little controversial, so hang on to your hats. Don't get too mad at me in the comments. Obviously, if you love these books, that is fantastic. I wish I did too. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. Starting off the list, I'm going to talk about a YA duology I read back in January. This is super beloved, but all in all for me just did not land very successfully, and that is These Violent Delights and Our Violent Ends by Chloe Gong. This is one of those situations where I feel like the concept was fantastic. I love the idea of this book, but for me, the execution just did not work totally. But if you're not familiar, this is a historical YA fantasy set in the 1920s in Shanghai. It's also a Romeo and Juliet retelling about 2 rival gangs who have been at each other's throats for a very long time. It also includes elements of the political reality of Shanghai during this time period, especially in regards to the colonization attempts by Japan. Again, I feel like the idea of this book is fantastic, and it definitely had a few strengths. First off, it is full of a lot of really fun angst. We follow our main character, Juliet, who is a part of one of these gangs. You see her come back into town and she quickly gets involved in a lot of the political aspects of this world. There's a lot of will they won't they with the other sort of heir to the other gang. I feel like those elements were really fun to read. I also appreciated the political aspects that were included within this book. Chloe Gong really used the historical reality of this time period to influence large parts of the story, and I do feel like that was great. I feel like what really fell flat for me was actually the fantasy component of this story. There's this sort of murder, mystery, evil bug that's sort of invading the city, and it really wasn't fleshed out too well, and it got very, very repetitive very quickly. And even going into book 2, which still had the same strengths as book 1, the sort of fantasy component was quite frankly the exact same and was plagued with the exact same issues, but because it was really like a copy and paste, I kind of had even less patience for it reading it again in book 2. Again, I really did enjoy parts of Chloe Gong's writing. I just feel like the fantasy elements were a little rushed and underdeveloped. This was just okay for me. I think because it was so hyped and so many people loved this so much, I went in with really high expectations. If the concept sounds interesting to you, I do think it's still worth the read, and I will probably read other books by this author in the future because I feel like there's a lot of potential. But all in all, I felt these 2 books really just kind of landed flat for me and were more like 2.5-star reads. Next up, I have the one that I'm the most scared to mention. I feel like this could result in quite a few dramatic comments, and I'm going to mention The Dragon Reborn by Robert Jordan. Here's the thing. I have been reading The Wheel of Time now for about a year. I've read the first 3 books, and ironically, the 3rd book was actually my favorite of the ones I've read so far. But what I'm trying to say with including this book on my list is I just don't get the hype around The Wheel of Time. They're all okay, but for the most part, it's repetitive. I don't really get how Robert Jordan goes about approaching his plots. I feel like we spend a lot of time on some things, which I don't mind, but when we actually get to the combat elements, it's like someone falls asleep, we wake back up, and it's the end. All these climactic moments are over in pages, but we spend, 500 pages leading up to them. I just feel like there's some narrative balance missing here. I also feel like a lot of the plot feels the same going into book 3, and I'm just kind of waiting for something else to sort of happen. I really think I should preface this by saying I love long fantasy series. I love slowly paced fantasy series. Robin Hobb is one of my favorite authors of all time, but I just don't really understand why he's spending the time he has in certain places. I am liking The Wheel of Time. I really am. I think each book has been about a 3-star read for me, but so many people lauded this series as like the greatest work of fantasy of all time. So I went into this read with a lot of expectations, and while elements of it I find cozy, I find the traditional aspect of this fantasy world to be really homey and entertaining to read in general. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around how this is the best fantasy series of all time, and I'm just waiting to be blown away. I'm going to continue to read the rest of the books in this series, but I feel like it's taking me forever, and I think it's taken me forever because I'm just kind of underwhelmed by the entire experience so far. But again, I want to love this so bad. I'm just sort of waiting for that aha moment. Maybe it'll finally happen, maybe in like book 9. Who knows? I will keep trying, but I just feel like they're disappointing because they're good. They just have not blown my mind like I feel like people are telling me that they should, if that makes sense. Next up, I have a couple very anticipated releases that just absolutely did not deliver in my opinion. The first is House of Breath and Sky by Sarah J. Maas. I've talked about this book a lot on my channel and how much I did not like it. This should not be a surprise. I feel like people try to argue that this book was all about foreshadowing, really indicating for later books in the series, but to me that does not excuse 600 pages of literally nothing. We had an interesting beginning and an interesting end. Nothing that happened in the middle actually served the plot in any real way, which created a really repetitive story for me. And honestly, I can read repetitive stories if the characters are in any way interesting. This book was way too male POV heavy. We completely disregarded some beloved side characters we were introduced in book one. There was no endearing or fun romances to read along with. Everything felt rushed. I didn't like anyone. I especially don't like our main characters. But yet, I will read book 3 because she did get me at the end. But oh my gosh, this book was so bloated. We also have Book of Night by Holly Black. I was so excited about this book. This is Holly Black's first adult fantasy release, and the concept of it was so cool. It basically follows our main character who used to be a really lauded thief. It's set in our world and in like present day. In this fantasy world, shadow magic exists. Some people can harness the power of their shadows in different ways, and this has also created sort of a black market where people sell shadows and other types of magical items, and this is where our main character used to thrive, again, as a thief. But now she's trying to kind of live a straight and narrow path. Figures from her past sort of rise up in her life once again, drawing her back in. Again, elements of this book I liked. I really felt like we were grounded in our main character's point of view. We had flashbacks and all of that was cool. I think the concept of the magic was cool, but it was missing Holly Black's like beautiful and interesting writing. It was missing all of the great intensity I feel like we get in her YA series. And I also just felt like the escalation of the plot just sort of was very predictable and very underwhelming for me in the end. I was really sad about this one. I really thought I was going to love it, but it just did not deliver for me personally. Next up, I have Guild. This is another very beloved sort of romance-forward fantasy story, and I do want to say I read the sequel, Glint, and I liked it. So this is more of a criticism specifically on the first book, and I actually recommend if you are interested in this series, which again is a fun, romance-centered fantasy story, skip Guild altogether. I feel like it doesn't serve the plot any way, shape, and form, and I actually feel like its use of trauma, plot especially, was way over the top, and there was way too much on-page like trauma writing. It's incredibly triggering. Every trigger warning you could imagine exists in this book, and I felt like it was completely unnecessary and used for shock factor in my mind. But this is the first book, and more so the prequel to the Plated Prisoner series, and this is a King Midas sort of retelling. We follow our main character who is a prisoner of King Midas. She's kept in a cage in his castle. She loves him. He basically saved her as a child, but he also treats her terribly, and this book goes into great and very specific detail of how he treats her, and it's very, very, very disturbing. It's supposed to give our character a starting off point so we can understand where she has come from and all the trauma she has to overcome in like later book. But I again feel like all of that could have been achieved in how it was written in the second installment. So again, if you're interested in this, just skip to book 2. It does have a lot of fun angst, and there's enough flashbacks for you to kind of understand what in the world happens in book 1. I hated Guild. I gave it like negative stars if I could. Next I have The Hand of the Sun King. This book really surprised me. This is not a bad book. I feel like, especially in comparison to some of the other books I've referenced, this is an okay book, but I think because so many people told me it was going to be possibly a new all-time fave, and the tropes and the concepts laid out in the synopsis just really appealed to me, I went into this with such high expectations, and I felt like it ultimately just kind of landed a little flat. In this story, we follow our main character, Wen Adler, and he is sort of torn between two worlds. The world of his father, the world of the Empire, and very specific and rigorous magic, and he's been training and schooling his entire life to basically become a part of this empire, but the other side of him is torn to his mother's heritage, one of wild magic and folklore and stories. Basically, his mother's family and his grandmother are part of a group of people who have been colonized by the Empire itself. itself. And growing up, Wen has again been trained to serve the Empire, but he's also been exposed to so many stories and the wild magic of his mother's people too. So in this book, we follow Wen as he kind of takes on his government posting, but also is constantly torn between these two political realities. You see him try to take on this profession, but also get involved in rebellion. It's all great in theory, and again, the concepts of this were really, really strong. I just felt like everything felt a little too underdeveloped for me. I couldn't help but compare it to the Traitor Baru Cormorant, which deals with some similar themes, but was also just amazing in every way, shape, and form. And I just feel like if the author kind of fleshed things out a bit more, it would have had a lot more impact. It was good. It just wasn't great. And that's just how I feel about it at the end of the day. Next, we have The Death of Jane Lawrence, another book I was so excited about. I read this around Halloween. This is a gothic horror story, and when it comes to horror, I especially love a gothic setting. Any type of dramatic Jane Eyre romance, haunted house, eerie vibes. I love that combination. It just really, really works for me. I was especially excited about this book. This follows our main character Jane, who is very practical, and she's done the math and realizes that a marriage of convenience is her best way forward. It would allow her to continue to pursue her interests, but also have the security that inevitably a marriage brings. She's also done the research of all the eligible bachelors in her area and has landed on a young and handsome rich doctor. Then visits him, she speaks with him, and he's very hesitant, but ultimately does agree. He has one stipulation though, and that is she is to never visit his crumbling family manor at any point during their marriage, because this is not a marriage of love or romance or anything. They both agree that the practical realities of this marriage are something they're both interested in. Of course though, due to a variety of circumstances, Jane does end up at this manor and kind of stuck there. So she arrives and everything kind of begins to spiral out of control here. I like parts of this book. Again, the gothic elements are great. There's also like horror medical elements that I also think work really well too. And there's also like a magic haunting element. All of those I felt like added great vibes. What bothered me about this book is that the character motivations made literally zero sense. Start this book with the character we are told to be very practical, not wanting to have any type of romantic relationship at all. It's completely fine with all the rules that she sets forward to her new husband, and everything is great. But this is thrown out the window like immediately. Immediately begin to have feelings for one another, and Jane begins to be like jealous and controlling in ways that make no sense. Like this entire scenario was her idea, and she immediately starts to act like irrational. Completely pulled me out of the story because it just did not line up with what we were told. It's like I had so much dissonance in my mind because it just didn't make sense that she was acting in these ways at all based on the initial introduction we got of her character. And for that, it just did not land for me. This book also has like pretty bad reviews on Goodreads. I'm definitely not the only one who struggled with the characterization of our main character Jane in this book because it was just bizarre. And the last book I'm going to talk about is The Daughter of the Moon Goddess, another book I wanted to love so bad, and also another book I recommend checking out if the synopsis even sounds remotely interesting to you, because you might like it. Because again, I wish I did. But this is a folklore mythology-centered fantasy story. We follow our main character who is the daughter of the Moon Goddess. She was raised on the moon with her mother, but she's always had to stay hidden from the evil celestial emperor. One day though, her magic flares, alerting this emperor of her existence, so she has to flee to save her mother, begins this quest through the celestial empire itself, trains and kind of works on her powers and abilities to set her mother free and also kind of upend the empire itself. Conceptually, fantastic. I love the folklore and mythology elements of this book. I love the setup of this book, but for me, the pacing was just really, really off. Everything happened so fast. I never felt like I got to sit with the intensity of moments because we were moving on to the next. Some people really enjoyed the fast-paced element of this pacing. Why I really push people to just try the book for themselves if it's interesting, because that pacing style might work for you, but for me, I just felt like I needed more time to become acclimated to the stakes of different situations. I feel like there's a little bit of insta-love and just instant connection between characters. So ultimately, it did not land for me, but it really might land for you. So give it a try if you're interested. Alrighty guys, those are the 9 books that for me were the worst reads of 2022. I would love to hear about some books that did not live up to your expectations. I'm curious, let's gossip a bit in the comments, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!